where are these guys coming from, these pedagogical technologists? And we can frame the pedagogical technologist in terms of where a school is at. Not every school, again, can support a pedagogical technologist. Why? Because schools are going through all different levels of change with regard to technology. Some schools may be, for example, using information technology on a limited basis in a school. It may not even be on their radar. Other schools may say, hey, using technology in the classroom, not only in the classroom, but in the entire school, is going to be a focal point for us. All right? So there are different stages of IT integration, not only in teaching and learning, but just in the school's ways of doing. And there are different frameworks. In fact, there's so many frameworks that basically try to describe this process in terms of stages. All right? And a few things that we can kind of collect from examining these frameworks, I just looked at these four, is that there are different ways to respond to technology. All right? You can embrace it, you can be lukewarm to it, you can reject it. And there are also different types of obstacles. All right? Now, it's not just the people, but it's the ways of doing between the people that can be obstacles. And something that I was thinking about before was, okay, this IT coordinator. Can we envision the IT coordinator as someone who can take you from like this step here to this step? Is this person going to bridge certain stages? Or is the IT coordinator someone who's found only at certain levels, certain stages of IT maturity in a school? All right? And, I thought it could be either way, but then I was reading about Nikki Davis, and Nikki Davis wrote in 2008 something really important about school change and using an ecological perspective. And she was writing about IT coordinators as being at a certain stage. So we can say that at a certain stage, and she says when ICT use becomes localized, well, it emerges from localized to become systemic, then we see the emergence, a need for an IT coordinator. So at a certain stage, we can see an IT coordinator emerging. But what she doesn't address is what happens when the school moves to another stage, for example. What happens to the IT coordinator then? I was actually talking to one of these pedagogical technologists at the Chinese International School yesterday. And she posed something very, very curious. She said that the pedagogical technologist, the unit of analysis of my study, is going to become extinct. And I was like, wow, this is a very bold claim. I was like, most schools don't even have pedagogical technologists. But she was like, here's the deal. So soon as all of the teachers in the school themselves become innovators and integrators of technology, then you don't need the technologist anymore. The technologist dies. I was like, wow, that is prescient. That requires just like looking far ahead. I mean, she's looking like over here, like beyond. Like right now, all of us, when we think about technology in schools and we're thinking about still IT coordinators, we're still kind of like around here. But she's thinking ahead. Ultimately, you don't need the pedagogical technologist anymore so soon as the school is continually evolving and embracing that evolution. So I was like, okay, great. All right. Before I get to my conceptual framework, let's talk about the ecological metaphor. It is a great way to explain change and innovation in schools. All right. And there have been some seminal works by John Frank and again Davis, and Nancy Law and Bob and Alan just wrote a book using the ecological metaphor as well. And it's, again, a good way to understand technology use and innovation. And again, while it's not totally applicable, we can borrow some ideas that schools are comprised of species, teachers, principals, innovative pedagogical practices, traditional pedagogical practices. All right, there are different species, and some are organic, and some are not organic. All right, some can breathe, some cannot breathe. All right? In addition, there are keystone species, species that are endemic and important to the environment, such as teachers. You can't have a school ecology without teachers for the time being. All right? Then there are invasive species, such as innovative pedagogical practices. So a lot of in these studies, the innovative pedagogical practice is the invasive species, something new that's coming to replace the traditional species, the traditional pedagogical practice. We can consider the pedagogical technologist to be an invasive species. All right? And again, these species cooperate and they also compete against each other. All right? So for example, a pedagogical technologist needs to cooperate with the teachers. So they're cooperating, these species, whereas maybe traditional versus innovative pedagogical practices, these are competing species. They're in interdependent and nested ecologies. A school is more than a school. A school is placed within a community, within a nation, within this world. All right? And they all have, they're permeous, so they can influence each other. What happens in one ecology, one level, can affect another level. And there's carrying capacity in farming. The idea that certain schools, again, can only support certain types of species. So a school that perhaps is very conservative in its ways can only perhaps support traditional pedagogical practice. They can't even support an IT coordinator at this point because all the pedagogical practice is traditional and it's localized. It hasn't been scaled up yet. All right, so there's carrying capacity in schools, in ecologies. And farming. The idea that you can introduce something into an ecology. All right? But that, again, as Nancy Law writes, it's a painstaking process. You have to be very, very careful because in some instances you introduce something to environment and it dies. You introduce a new colleague to the school, colleague leaves. All right? Okay, let's get to the framework. This is my conceptual framework. This is a two-tier nested ecology. There is a global ecology, and then there's a school ecology. I created these two ecologies, and this is specific for non-mainstream schools in Hong Kong. Why? Because Hong Kong is not a state. No, Hong Kong is a state, but it's not a nation. And it has very little influence, heavy-handedness, on a non-mainstream school, on an international school, for example. The international school has a lot of power, a lot of flexibility, right? The government's, in fact, just a minor player, all right, compared to its role in aided in government schools. And we can see that the people in the schools, including the teachers and maybe the parents and the students and everyone, they tend to have more of a global outlook. They come from abroad. They come from the nations. They don't necessarily come from Hong Kong. That's why I don't include a Hong Kong ecology. All right? Okay, so we can see different kinds of species at the global level. These are institutions. The state, you see businesses, professional organizations, educational institutions, the community. They affect this school, which is also a species in the globe. So we can see at the global level we have institutional species. Now, within the school, I include biotic species and abiotic species. Biotic species, principal parents, these guys, and the pedagogical technologist. All right, this is one biotic species within the school. And then environing them are the abiotic species, the ways of doing in a school. And the ones that I think are important for this study include professional development, and what else do we have here? Teaching through IT, relationships, shared vision, and I culled these from the literature on school change through technology, policies, infrastructure, and leadership. Okay, so I consider these abiotic species, and they work with the biotic species, including pedagogical technologists, and in some, you get a school. All right? Now, what else interests me besides these species at the global and school levels is the individual himself, all right, the pedagogical technologist. how does this guy